Kia ora.
Thank you.
Whakawhawhanga Fletcher Tabuteau.
Aloha lalei, Madam Speaker. Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to this debate. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Honourable Todd McLay and ask the incessant buzz from the opposite side of the House to stop. I was with the Honourable Todd McLay when this was signed by those in attendance at the time, and I acknowledge his efforts. I have no doubt that the other side of the House has brought up New Zealand First position at the time. We did write a minority report to the PACER Plus, and I'd just very briefly like to touch on the thinking of that. So the Minister of Trade, and I acknowledge him in the House, had fantastic effort. But our position at the time, Madam Speaker, was around essentially the timing of where PACER Plus had got to in the conversations with our Pacific neighbours. So when you look at the current state of the signatories and at the time it was signed, we still have the critical issue of not having signed in or brought into the conversation to any great degree some of the biggest players in the Pacific. Fiji is still not a signatory. Papua New Guinea is still not a signatory, and they represent proportionately, in terms of Pacific trade, population, economic activity, actual exports, import figures, a large and significant proportion of trade in the Pacific. So at the time, New Zealand First said, well, what is the rush? Why are we trying to push this now? And we wrote our minority report. Now, some would argue that have made the point in the House, why have we changed our position? Well, I'll tell you why, Madam Speaker. Because, as many have acknowledged, this isn't a traditional trade agreement. This is an agreement where New Zealand has sought to empower that blue continent, to say to our cousins, our neighbours, actually what we're trying to achieve is to grow your economies through trade, to make a sustainable economy through good export, and yes, to help you with imported goods where we think New Zealand has those efficiencies. What's changed, Madam Speaker? What is fundamentally different, and it's very important to note it in the House tonight, is that the Right Honourable Winston Peters, as the Minister of Foreign Affairs with this government, set out to change to reinvigorate, to make significant again our relationship with the Pacific, to say that together, and only together, can we move this blue continent forward. And so what we have created, this government has done through the Right Honourable Winston Peters, is the Pacific Reset. And I acknowledge, I think it was the contribution from the Honourable Tim McIndoe, who acknowledged that this government has absolutely raised the stakes in terms of monetary contribution. And actually, Madam Speaker, I now am very proud to talk to the House about my efforts in the Pacific, because I personally see PACER Plus now in conjunction with the Pacific Reset, and actually I'd like to acknowledge our Trade Minister in regards to our focus on trade and our trade for all, because that has resonated in the Pacific. They understand what it is we're trying to achieve. So if you put all of that together and in this House talk about the potential synergies we're trying to create with the Pacific Reset, and I would argue tonight that New Zealand First is absolutely focused on using PACER Plus as an enabling tool to engage with our Pacific neighbours. The previous contribution spoke about phytosanitary measures, biosecurity. Well, actually, what we're trying to do here, and once again I say it for the House's benefit, this isn't a traditional trade deal. This is an attempt to empower our Pacific neighbours, our cousins, and to build capacity for sustainable exports and sustainable economic growth so that long-term this blue continent grows together, and New Zealand is absolutely a part of that. So already on the ground, Madam Speaker, for those countries, our Pacific Island countries who have signed up to PACER Plus, we have deployed resource in terms of empowering and enabling the issues that they've had with the compliance issues in terms of our quite high standards for accepting imports in New Zealand. We're adamant that we must maintain those standards, but we're absolutely adamant that we cannot block our neighbours from exporting into New Zealand because that's potentially a great income generator for them. So the question is, what do we do? Well, we don't tell them you haven't met the requirements. We go to them and say, how can we help? That's right. And that is what we've been doing. And that is the conversations I have had the privilege to have on behalf of this government in the Pacific about empowering the Pacific itself to take advantage of that. And we see today, and we saw at the time, that there are nations there who have said, yes, this is a way forward for us. But if you take the Marshall Islands and Palau, for example, they had a regime change, and in my conversations with them, they hadn't been briefed by their own bureaucracy, their own administration, on what PACER Plus was and what potential it represented for them. So New Zealand needs to be part of the solution there, because I believe if they knew what it was this agreement had to offer for them in conjunction with the Pacific Reset, in conjunction with New Zealand's philosophy on trade for all, I think that is a conversation that they want to have. And actually, I think New Caledonia and New Caledonia and French Polynesia have been mentioned. They are excited about the possibility of this PACER Plus. We just need to have those conversations with them. So, look, it's something that's important. I'm proud to be part of the efforts in the Pacific in this space. I do believe that the PACER Plus is a tool that we can use for empowerment for our Pacific neighbours, for New Zealand. Let's not kid ourselves. This government thinks it will be good for New Zealand exporters as well. So, on that note, Madam Speaker, thank you for the opportunity, and it is a pleasure to rise on behalf of New Zealand First to support this enabling legislation. Thank you.
Stuart Smith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm not going to attempt